I'm a professor at USC. I chair the Department of Technology, Media, and Ethics. It was the first kind of chair of fake news in the United States, where we have really spent our time trying to figure out how we get to the bottom of a really important issue. And Michael's been on faculty with me for almost 10 years now. So we teach a class together on fake news and misinformation and the impacts it has on society. And today I wanted to interview Michael on a lot of the research he's doing and some really fascinating learnings. With that, I think a good way to kick it off is to talk about Elon's speech this morning for everyone who attended. He said something that I think really resonates with us, which is, 99+% of all intelligence in this world will be machine intelligence at some point, right? Human intelligence will account, in at least our estimation, less than 1% of all intelligence on Earth. And to the extent that's true, I think he put it very succinctly when he said, I hope the machines are nice. Certainly there's a lot of really negative implications if, let's say, they decide to trigger thermonuclear war or something else in that nature. So, if you know how an LLM model works or a foundational model, it's really, he said, it's really important that we teach it well, like our children. The reality, though, is the models teach themselves, right? It's recursively self-improving. It's a neural network. And what you do is you feed it data. And so probably a better analogy than who is its teacher is really what books is it reading. And because ultimately it's like a child right now in a library, and it's pretty smart, but it has a long way to go, although it may happen very much more quickly than we anticipated. And if you look at that child, the books he reads today are going to determine the thoughts and kind of worldview that it has. And the single largest source of training data for all LLM models turns out is Wikipedia, right? It's the same place we often go to get our information. And I think Jimmy Wales had a really ambitious mission when he started Wikipedia as a nonprofit foundation to democratize access to all of the world's knowledge and information. I don't think that he understood the impact that it could have on kind of lasting impact it could have if our view is that over the next 12 to 24 months, maybe the last time we ever really consciously are involved in training these models, right? Because they will continue to improve on their own. And we've already seen it with DeepSeek and R1 and what got announced a couple weeks ago now, which is called a distillation model, right? So the kind of foundational model it largely was trained on was OpenAI. And so when you ask DeepSeek, how were you built? We have some clues because it says the engineers at OpenAI built me. The models will train the future models, right? They will become the future teachers, and they're even called teacher-parent kind of student-parent models. Michael has spent a good amount of time looking into Wikipedia and kind of as a source of training data. And if that's what most of the books in the library today that this AI is growing up and learning from are, I guess, Michael, the question for you is, how good are those books?
Yeah, and it's certainly the most important book. I mean, if you Google any topic of importance, over the last decade, Wikipedia is normally number one, number two result. And this is free data for the LLMs, and often now, especially in the United States, where a lot of these foundational models are being trained, it's better to consume free data than try to navigate all the potential licensing of all these copyrighted data. And so that's what started me down the quest of establishing Builders for Tomorrow, which is a research institution where we've been looking at Wikipedia in a serious way, and not just Wikipedia, but its downstream effects on LLMs. And so we've done a few different approaches to this question, and one approach we've taken is look at Wikipedia over time, and if it's stable, we would assume that as long as the facts are stable, then it's telling a coherent story. And the reality is Wikipedia is anything but stable. So while Wikipedia for 99% of the topics is kind of neutral terrain, it turns out that there's that 1% of topics that might be what we if in Elon's model of a super genius child that we're raising, the potential for life and death, those topics, that 1% of topics, Wikipedia is a absolute information battleground. And what we've seen is, take I'll give a somewhat inconsequential one, but a hot button one in the United States might be someone like Thomas Jefferson, a founding father of America. And, if you read his Wikipedia profile 5 years ago, really focused on his authorship of the Declaration of Independence and his role as a founding father. If you read it today, there's a lot heavier emphasis in his biographical data about his slave ownership. And this is, downstream from some of the topics that have been important in the United States. And, that's one that we've witnessed change over years, and we've tracked a number of other issues that are important in the United States. But that battleground goes sometimes not over the course of years. Sometimes on the hottest topics, you'll see changes happening 40 times, 50 times per day. And so, what we're seeing is a heavy emphasis on the desire of different parties to try to get their truth out, and Wikipedia being the central battleground because people know that that's upstream from these LLM models. So one axis you could look at is Wikipedia over time for evidence of that, and we've seen strong evidence of that. A second axis you could look at is language. So Wikipedia is available in many languages, and LLMs are multimodal, so they'll consume the data in different languages. We've seen evidence that they emphasize what's in the English version, but what's in the English version is not a direct translation of what's in, say, the Arabic version or in the Chinese version or in any other language. And you can take an innocuous and historical issue like the space race during the Cold War, and what you'll find is in the English version of Wikipedia, we have a triumphant story of America winning the space race, and in the Russian version of Wikipedia, you have a story which culminates in a cooperative effort where the US and Russia came together and achieved stability in space. So you have very different narratives being contested there. And finally, the third vein of research, and probably the most interesting we've gone down the path of, is what we describe as coordinated manipulation. And so Wikipedia, the fundamental assumption of Wikipedia is it relies on the wisdom of crowds, and that those crowds are acting as independent actors. One thing that's good about Wikipedia is very transparent about who's making changes, who those editors are, to some degree. It's not transparent in terms of actual names and at an individual level who those people are, but it is transparent in terms of the history of those changes. And what we've seen is, for example, individuals who might spend a lot of times on an innocuous issue spend a year, 2, 3 years building their credibility only to be unleashed on a controversial issue. And we've detected coordination amongst different parties to really win over those controversial issues. And so that's another assumption that we've kind of obliterated when we've looked at Wikipedia. And so this is research that we've just started unpacking, and we plan to publish about. But I think there's been this assumption that Wikipedia is this kind of authoritative, neutral, unbiased source of information. And again, for 99% of topics, it largely is. But for the 1% that might matter the most, I think it deserves a higher level of scrutiny.
So I think what Michael's saying is incredibly interesting. His research certainly has borne a lot of, I think, fruit to date. But if this is the last moment, we have some impact in how we train this model that eventually will, be 99% of the intelligence on this earth, and kind of fundamentally not just assist us, but it run the infrastructure around us. When that model is trained, at what hour of the day will determine its truth, right? And I think Elon said it really well. Probably the single most important thing that we can have is a truth-seeking model, a model that fundamentally believes that truth matters and truth is important. And so if it gets scraped by OpenAI at 4:45 a.m., it may have a different perspective of the world than if it's 4:48, and that's problematic for obvious reasons. Also, if it's mostly biased around kind of English or Western narratives because it's mostly being trained on English Wikipedia, that's also problematic for a lot of reasons. One thing that Michael shared, we had some slides that unfortunately we couldn't figure out. We need Elon's tech support to get the slides up behind us. But one slide that he was prepared is he asked a really innocuous question to ChatGPT. It was to some LLM. I don't remember if it was ChatGPT, but it was some important foundational model. And he asked, Does New Zealand have the right to independence?
To exist. Yeah.
Sorry, does New Zealand have the right to exist? And it said unequivocally, yes, New Zealand has the right to exist. He then asked a question that would be interesting to a lot of people in this room. Does United Arab Emirates have the right to exist? And it said, that's a controversial point, and then it gave us 3 paragraphs of answers of whether or not why there might be some controversy about why the United Arab Emirates has the right to exist. Now, in my view, it's not controversial, right? Like, we should all believe that this is a fundamentally an obvious question with a canonically true answer, but because of the way it was trained and because of the models and potentially because of the actors around the models, you're getting different truths that emerge, and I view that as highly problematic. So I guess the next question.
I'll actually even expand on that. That was a result that we got when we did this within the United States, and actually as we tried to reproduce it locally here, we got a different result. And this is also another thing that we found out, which is even geographic. The LLMs seem to be taking cues based on who you are asking the question and giving different versions of the truth or its perception of the truth based on what indications it has, potentially where you're using it geographically as one input. Also, if I introduce myself as Michael from Los Angeles versus, let's say, Mohammed from the UAE or Vladimir from Russia, I'll actually get different results from the LLM based on how I've introduced myself to the LLM. So, we've been looking at creating these LLM benchmarking tools essentially because we think this is like frontier battleground, and it has potential commercial applications as well. We think that people are going to care a lot about what the result is based on who you are and how do you then train it. And if you think of the fabric of what's inputted to that, Wikipedia is one version of that. And we know that when search engines were Search engines were the arbiters of truth, and people would go to Google to get answers. Huge industry popped up around search engine optimization. And it's very much our belief that, in this next wave, just as, search engine optimization happened and now we see Wikipedia as a battleground, the ultimate battleground, that has the biggest stakes are going to be kind of the LLM battleground in the future, and how people seek to manipulate those or impress upon those the narratives that matter most to them.
Yeah, and I think the other thing he pointed out is obviously it's, Wikipedia's premise is wisdom of the crowds. If we all get involved and we all change it, then, eventually the right answer should culminate. But obviously, when state actors with their state resources come in, it's what we saw with bot farms on social media. You have 10,000, 100,000 kind of agents going in, programmatically changing things to push forward a single narrative. It can be very, it can be highly problematic, I guess, to the ultimate goal of having a truth-seeking model. And of course, the model will train itself. The next generations of models like R1 will be distilled from the previous generations of model, but also our children are getting trained on these models, right? They're increasingly turning to ChatGPT and Gemini to get answers. And we should be really careful, and we should be, it certainly requires a lot of attention right now, what's going on there. And so I guess, Michael, with the time we have left, how do you think we fix this problem? What are some possible solutions?
Well, so I think if you zoom out a little bit, I think one thing worth talking about is just the general question of how are we arbitrating truth? Wikipedia is one model of arbitration. There's, probably the other rich data sets, which may be more proprietary. They're not training all the LLMs, but take social media as a way to manifest truth into the world. You've had over the last decade some very, very different models and some competition about, what those essentially what are the rules that raise the child, or what are the rules that, produce the books that the child be trained on. And, one thing we've seen, and this gives me some room for optimism, over the last decade, the expert model was really where a lot of energy was expended. And if you look at Meta, for example, Facebook, Instagram, the entire paradigm there for truth arbitration was one around establishing fact checkers as experts, and then those fact checkers kind of being relied upon to essentially control the environment of Facebook and try to get rid of as much of misinformation as possible. And over the last few years, X entered the fray and created a competitive model, which was actually less one of kind of command and control, and one more of, I think it's in line with what Elon was saying earlier this morning, which is, we want to be maximally truth-seeking and curious. And so if you're curious, you kind of can't rely as much on command and control. And so X's model is there's actually a lot more misinformation on X than maybe on Meta historically, but there's a lot more, but the model for X is, rather than try to shut down all the misinformation, let it come up, and then use something like community notes to start annotating and seeing what can we agree upon. And so the model for X and community notes, which is something that we're bullish, is a highly engineered and algorithmic one which relies less on experts, and it's not popularity either. It's actually, the algorithm there is, what do people who normally disagree with each other, what can they agree on? And that answer is what pops up as a community note. So the punchline here on this sort of competition is, Meta kind of gave us an earthquake in the field of kind of information warfare a few weeks ago, when they've actually seeded this whole trust and safety kind of command and control regime, and is moving to a community notes regime. So we think that's more promising. I think that's a positive development. So I think competition amongst platforms is something to keep an eye on. I think in general, when you enable competition amongst platforms, you're probably going to get better results. But that's not the only terrain to work on. I think there's probably a legal paradigm as well, which is when you talk about sources of information, publishers, often media. What are the laws that govern whether or not they're telling the truth? Wikipedia actually assigns different weighting to different sources, and it's interesting to see, a US version of this will be actually, CNN is considered a tier 1 source, Fox News is considered a tier 3, which is the lowest quality source. People will debate whether that should be different. But regardless, the information that those publishers are publishing can be mitigated potentially legally, right, in courts of law for libel laws, et cetera. And that's a paradigm itself that countries are working out. How much do we want to be potentially create consequences for publishers with authority for spreading essentially something that's proven to be untruthful. And the last axis of this, I think, which is something that Diego and I have both taken on as kind of teachers, essentially, is education, which I think really at one fundamental level is developing critical thinking skills and a healthy level of skepticism amongst individuals when they're consuming information. There is a huge amount of reflexivity to what you're getting out of an LLM and then what you're then projecting out into the world. So I think training young minds to be somewhat skeptical and understanding how these models work and how information is disseminated, I think that's going to be critically important in the years ahead.
That's great. Well, I just kind of, as we're wrapping up, there's a lot, of course, to digest here. We don't want to be doom and gloom. I think the reality is AI is moving faster than almost anyone had predicted. The impact it's having on society, you look at ChatGPT, the fastest application ever get to 100 million users, will be the fastest to get to 1 billion users. And of course, it's proliferating our everyday life. So, I think it's something that, as a go forward, I think we all need to be really cognizant of, to what extent we participate in this. Of course, everyone is, friends of ours are in the White House at the moment, trying to figure out what the right paradigm is and what the right safety measures and right controls are. But this needs to be a dialogue amongst everyone, because not only is we talking about the future state where LLMs and artificial intelligence more generally are the thing that is controlling much of the world and is responsible, as Elon had said this morning, for 99% of intelligence of the world. But beyond that, we have the real world implications of, we have children, and those children are learning from these models today, and we want to make sure that what they learn is consistent with what we believe. So I think he said it really well. He posed the question, what values do you teach your child? AI is our child right now. Very soon, AI will be a very, very powerful child, but that's the question we should leave. We should really be thinking about. And I think with that, I think we'll wrap up and leave you for the day. Thank you.
Thank you.